think we're ready to start. So welcome everyone to the Knowledge and Innovation Foundations interview, and thanks to all of you for coming. So Ashish Arora is going to be our guest of honor today, but we'll have more on that later. Let me just tell you a few words about the Foundations interview and sort of where we're going with this. So the Foundations interview, this Foundations interview is the 10th time, so it's the 10th sort of anniversary, but it's only in its 9th year. So apparently one year there were two foundation scholars that were selected. In the past and today, we've been covering very eminent scholars that are of relevance and of interest to the Knowledge and Innovation group. I won't pick out any individual scholar because all of them were and are outstanding. What I will say is that Sid Winter was actually the first foundation scholar in 2011. So he sort of kicked off that tradition. This was an initiative by Gabriel Sulansky at INSEAD, and the idea and the format has really, it's worked out extremely well, and it's therefore stayed the same very much. There's an interview by two PhD students, which I'll introduce just now. And the idea is really, not for Ashish to give some sort of keynote speech where he's just going to give a 1-hour summary of what his work is about, but really it's about getting to know the person behind the papers, right? And of course, I mean, for all these events, we know, of course, that we're sampling on the dependent variable, right? So we're looking at successful scholars. And influential academics, but what we are interested in this in this Foundations interview is to really get to know or learn a little bit more about the process and what got Ashish to where he is and what made him work on the topics that he did and what the philosophy of Ashish's work is. Few words on the selection process. So the Associate Program Chair, and Chairperson of the interest group come up with a short list, and then we put it to the leadership team of the interest group to basically vote. And so as I said, I was very happy when Ashish came out as the star scholar this year. So let me now introduce our protagonists. I'm basically just presiding, and I've just asked for permission to sit in front and not on the panel. I think it was sort of given permission, or we'll see. Yes, grudgingly. So we have Agnes Günther, who's a PhD student at Copenhagen Business School. She's German. She studied design in the Netherlands and in Germany. Her work is on post-acquisition employee mobility and the composition of strategic human capital, and on cognition in decision-making. To her right is Maren Mikkeler, who's a PhD student at LMU Munich. She's also German. She studied communications and international business, both in southern and in northern Germany, and then spent some time in industry working for basically big media companies, working now on a PhD on knowledge seeking in intra-organizational platforms. Ashish Arora is not German, which sort of marks him out as the odd one out on this panel. But he's a Rex Adams Professor of Business Administration, which none of us are. He's Senior Associate Dean of Faculty at the Fuqua School of Business. He's Department Editor for the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Department of Management Science. Has a PhD from Stanford and a bachelor's and a master's degree in economics from Delhi in India. So I'm not going to talk about his work because that's what really the rest of the session will be about. Broadly speaking, it's on the economics and management of technological change. Personally, he is a fierce but constructive discussant. He is a tough but fair editor. And he's also a surprisingly keen follower of football, or soccer, as I should say, in this country. So I'm not sure we'll hear much about the last point, but you'll definitely get a flavor of the first 2 points, I'm sure. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Man, Agnes, and Ashish. Take it away, and thanks again for coming.
Well, thank you very much for this nice introduction, Tobias, and also warm welcome from our side to everyone who's made it here today, but also to everyone who's watching us from home, work, or anywhere else, since this session will be recorded and soon be uploaded to the YouTube channel of Strategic Management Society. So before we begin with some short information about the organization of this interview, in the beginning, Agnes and I have prepared some questions, and after this, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. Now, to get a short overview on Ashish's career and his work so far, we begin with some short stats. Ashish so far has published a tremendous amount of journal articles and book chapters, and he has been cited well above 1,700 times and belongs to the most influential researchers in management, especially in innovation research. Having a closer look on his work over time, Ashish got his PhD in 1992 from Stanford in economics, and after this established a quite stable record of papers, both in his 17 years at Carnegie Mellon, but also since 2009, where he actually joined Duke University, where he's also currently Senior Associate Dean.
Yes. And when we then look at your core research interests, there's one very dominant and outstanding, which is market of technologies, which you really shaped fundamentally and where you really early on got involved with. So because you got in so early on the division of innovative labor, could you maybe tell about how you come along there and maybe what inspired you to do that?
Sure. So thank you very much. Okay, thanks very much. So first, one of the themes that will come up is in my career, as I reflect, is how much I've benefited from the kindness of many people, and this is another such example. So I'm very grateful. Coming to the specific question, so maybe a little bit of background. When I joined the economics department at Stanford as a PhD student, I quickly realized that I wasn't interested in most things that they were doing. So vast chunks of economics were sort of, you would have to shoot me before I did them. There were a few things I was interested in, and I realized that I wasn't good enough. So I wanted to be a theorist, simply wasn't good enough. And one of the parts of growing up is to figure that part out and say, okay, let's move on. So I was basically drifting, as happens to PhD students in their careers. And I had the great fortune to connect through soccer with Alfonso Gambardella. So we started first by playing on the same soccer team. That was the beginning of our collaboration. And through Alfonso, I then got connected to Nate Rosenberg, because Alfonso was working for Nate, and he said, hey, Nate's looking for an RA, are you interested? I wasn't doing anything particular, so I said, sure. And so that was sort of the background. So one of the things Nate talks about, if you read his work, is Nate was not only a historian of technology, he was also a historian of economic thought. He was a scholar in the old sense. He read Smith and Marx deeply. And one of the things when Nate is talking about the growth of the American economy is he talks about the role of these specialized producers, machine tool producers, who act as repositories of knowledge, and they're passing this on to successive industries that use machine tools, from bicycles to firearms and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's just sort of background. And this struck me. This struck me as something very interesting. Nobody had ever talked about this stuff before. Now, if you read Smith, he talks about division of labor, but to see it fleshed out, that's the intellectual background. The second part is I'm in Stanford in the late 1980s, if you remember what's happening at that time is the birth of the biotech revolution. So there are companies like Genentech and Amgen that have been formed and that are now 4 or 5 years in, and more ones are forming. Biogen is formed in 1981, Genetics Institute. So there's more of these companies getting started up. And this is very new and exciting. And at this time, there is a debate raging in what would then become the economics or the management of innovation, which is David Teese is there. And the standard wisdom at this point, if you've read Teese, is these companies are screwed. Okay, that if you're a biotech company, you're screwed because the pharmaceutical companies hold all the cards. They have the downstream commercialization capabilities, and so the future is not bright for these people. Now, so if you think about where all this is coming from, so I'm now thinking about, hey, this is how America became rich. This is how the West grew rich through a process of specialization, division of labor. The most important force in growing rich is innovation and technology. Here is a fantastic example, biotech, of that, and we're being told that this is not going to work for these specialists. That was sort of the beginning of thinking about why. Why can't you make money like this? Why does everything have to go in this route? And what are the consequences? And I have to say, I didn't know this then, but if you read Ken Arrow in The Rate and Direction of Economic Activity, 1961, NBER, the famous place where Ken Arrow writes his papers, many other famous papers are there. At one point, Ken Arrow says, look, this is as a discussant to Ken Arrow is being a discussant to a guy called Mueller, who has a master's thesis. He's looking at DuPont, and what Mueller shows in his master's thesis is DuPont's rate of return on internal inventions as well as external inventions is about the same. So if you're thinking about open innovation, insourcing technology, Mueller says those days you could get a master's student to do that and get Ken Arrow to be your discussant. Ken Arrow says, look, isn't it interesting that DuPont should make the same amount of money from inventions it did not create relative to inventions it did create? And it's been a sobering realization for me that 30 years of my career have basically been a follow-up to that footnote by Ken Arrow. So my life is basically all my life's work is just working on a footnote by Ken Arrow. So, but anyway, I've rambled on. This is just to give you a sense for why I think this is an interesting and important question and the series of historical accidents by which I came to work on it.
So because looking at your other research topics that you worked on, on the first place, they don't really seem to be related. So how does your research stream evolve, and is it because you meet people like Alfonso, or is it because you start working at another place? So could you tell us a little bit about the development, how you got to the other points?
Yeah, no, I'd love to say that these are thematically related. They're not. My life has been a series of mostly fortunate accidents. As I said, kindness, people come and say, and offer opportunities. In particular, the one on information systems, I went to Carnegie Mellon, I did stuff for a bit. I nearly got fired because I was working on the history of the chemical industry, and they was like, what kind of an economist are you? What are you doing? Fortunately, I escaped by the skin of my teeth. I did not get fired. And so to be valuable to my university, the school I was in had two wings. There was a school of policy, and there was this burgeoning information systems. And we were sitting right next to something called the Software Engineering Institute, which was responsible at that time for coordinating all cybersecurity responses for the US. This is called the CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team. So they were literally in the building next to mine. Long story short, it was decided that we, the Heinz School of Public Policy, should do something. My then dean came to me and said, will you teach in this? And I said, what do I know about cybersecurity? And he said, you're an economist, cost benefit, go teach. So I did. And I started talking to the people, these people at the Computer Emergency Response Team. I realized they were really smart, but they were basically peddling recipes, right? There was no thought through framework of what's going on. Because they worked, so the Software Engineering Institute worked for the US Air Force. They were called FFRDC. What that meant was their mind was, was like, okay, here are bad guys trying to attack us. When I actually looked at the data, it struck me that the right metaphor for that was a public health metaphor. There was infections everywhere. It's not like the bacteria are singling out hard to attack him. It's just like, well, you were unlucky you got infected. And so anyway, that was a very productive part. One of my first management science publications was there, so it's just kind of a good thing. The other stuff generally, as you can see, has more of a link to it. The history of the chemical industry turned out to be very useful because there are these specialized firms whose business model was based on licensing. There's some really cool stories I can tell you about how these firms came to be and what they're doing. So that was incredibly helpful. Every time I ran a regression or wrote down a model, at least I could think about, like, is this somehow consistent with what I know? And of course, patents and IP stuff is interesting. There was a while I worked on that. So in the end, if you squint at it, it kind of doesn't look weird. It sort of looks connected. There was no grand plan, much to my friend Alfonso's dismay. There was no grand strategy that said, here's what's going to happen. It's been a series of lucky accidents. So I don't know. I'm sorry, it's not more glamorous than that.
But are you kind of planning to go back to the origins, or where do you see it heading?
Yeah, so after I came to a business school, so and I looked around for new things, and again, by a lucky coincidence, one of the people who reached the same time as I did was a guy called Sharon Belanzon. Some of you may know him. And Sharon's an incredibly energetic, capable guy. He reminds me a lot of a young Alfonso in that sense. And so, we started talking. Most of our interactions were, Sharon would say something, I would say, no, that's stupid. Go back, this is not anyway, the good thing was he wasn't discouraged by my negativity. And we started talking, and at some point we decided that we should do something on the investments in research by corporations. To cut to the chase, to answer Agnes's question, well, I think what I want to do now is to look at how the innovation ecosystem in America has changed. If you go back to 1880s, we had a system which was individual inventors, guys like Edison and others, selling their inventions. And this is Naomi Lamoureux and Ken Sokolov sort of first showed this systematically. I didn't pay much attention then, but I think it was a really brilliant work they did. And then somewhere, say, starting 1900s, the system changed, large firms came up. By 1950s, the dominant mode was large companies like Bell Labs, Xerox, DuPont doing invention internally. And if you look at most of the models of economics and also a lot of management, that's the dominant model that they have. Companies do R&D, produce inventions, commercialize, earn money, kind of a vertically integrated model. Since about the 1980s, as I started, this model has been fraying and changing. One big change has been the role of universities. For the first time, really, universities are the major source of knowledge, which was not true in America, certainly till 1950 and maybe even later, which people forget, but historically they were not that useful in terms of pushing out scientific boundaries. So now we have these very capable universities, lots of them, lots of public money into them, and we have this new ecosystem where universities produce research, startups, establish incumbent firms, and I want to understand how well this is working, in what sectors this is working, and where is it not working. And so in some sense, it connects both innovation and entrepreneurship.
Now, looking at your track of records, most of your papers are co-authors with Alfonso Gambardella and Andrea Fosfori at the top. Can you tell us a bit more about your preferred way of working?
Sure. My preferred way of working is to let my co-authors work, which is why these are the people who are foolish enough to work with me. And so, and one reason, this is an honest confession, is there's nothing quite as paralyzing for me as a blank sheet of paper. Getting that first stuff written is incredibly painful. I could spend days, find all kinds of creative reasons not to do that. Being a dean is good for that reason. There's always some crisis or the other I have to solve so that I don't have to work on that. So co-authors are good for at least a couple of reasons. First, they take away this problem, well, because they start. Two, there's nothing quite like guilt to get me at least to do what I'm supposed to do, right? If it's just for myself, it's like, okay. But if it's somebody else, well, then there's a bigger sense of obligation, and co-authors are great for that. But mostly the guys I've worked with have been the creative sparks. They have provided the intellectual seed, if you like, and I was more the person who was kind of tidying stuff up in that sense and saying, yeah, we can make it better this way. So in that sense, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to my co-authors, probably more than they realize. Well, they must get something out of it, otherwise they won't come back. So, it's not quite there's probably some gains from trade, I suspect, but I think I've been the beneficiary of the kindness of my co-authors as well. Yeah, so for all the PhD students, that stuff never changes. The tyranny of the blank sheet of paper, it's horrible.
So Tobias already mentioned it, that you're not German, you grew up in India, and you also done quite some work on, for example, the Indian software industry. So how does your biography influence your work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I've had reason to reflect upon it. I guess the way I think about it is I'm always an outsider on the margins of things, never quite belonging to any club, no club that would have me at any rate. I'm not sure, I think some of it has to do with circumstance. So I grew up in India, immigrated to America. I'm neither American. If you ask my kids, they certainly don't think I'm American. And well, because my kids are American, and I'm not. I went to an economics department and have never worked in one. My PhD's from there. So it's always been, I'm sort of I'm always on the edges. I always feel like an outsider, an imposter. And so I guess this probably, and there's probably a personality flaw as well, which is I have to do things my way. And that prevents me from being accepted. But
do you think that being an outsider also enables you to do that more than being really an insider in that sense?
No, I think actually it would have been much easier as an insider. But it was hard to, particularly when I was young, I've become better now. I was too pig-headed to listen and too pig-headed to give in. It's always hard to play your life in reverse, sort of replay it and say what would have happened. You never quite get to play it that way. But it's, so what I can say is I don't think I regret it, but I think it would have been easier as an insider. I suspect it would have been looked very different, the kinds of stuff I did. Being an outsider, you don't get to hear what's the right way to do things, what are the interesting, important questions. You kind of just figuring stuff out for yourself. It's not a good way to make a career.
Now, speaking of being an outsider, we've already learned that you received your PhD in economics and pretty soon transitioned into management research. Could you maybe explain us the reasons therefore, but also how you would define yourself as a researcher nowadays?
So I think that this comes up a lot because I'm in a business school, in a strategy group, and we constantly have these discussions, economics, management, all this kind of stuff. Here's sort of my take on this. I'm trained as an economist. I was trained to think as one. That's how I think. I'm not an economist, however. It's super important to emphasize that. And in my view, we have to distinguish between the tools and the tribe, or if you like, between the tools and the prejudices. So all tribes have, customs, things that are sacred, things that are taboo. I don't subscribe to the taboos of economists. We use the same tools. And I think this confusion has been a source of a great deal of angst in various places where if you talk about markets, well, you must ipso facto be an economist because why else would you talk about markets? Well, I think the future for syncretic fields such as management and strategy we're going to borrow from the fundamental disciplines of economics, sociology, and psychology as appropriate, just as electrical engineering came out of physics. It came out of high energy and low energy physics at different ends. And for a while, it was physicists doing electrical engineering, and at some point, electrical engineering became a discipline in and of itself. We're in that process of going through that. And so there'll be some lines will be drawn, but I think in the end, the tools we're going to borrow from are the ones from these disciplines. What we must not do is borrow them wholesale, borrow all their taboos, all their, the things that economists hold sacred. We don't have to agree to those. We have to figure out our own taboos and what are interesting questions. And that's, I think, the more useful way is what kinds of questions do we work on? What do we find interesting? How sacred or how sacrilegious would it be not to have a causal claim in your story? How terrible would it be to have a qualitative analysis? These are things we as a field have to sort out for ourselves. So for 6 years, I was editor at Research Policy, which was a very different journal from Management Science. Most of the papers I published, I accepted, were sort of non-econ papers. Because the econ papers typically were, the econos thought of that as a vertically differentiated journal, as a lower quality journal. Whereas for many people who were thinking about the phenomenon, Research Policy was a first-year journal, and so those are the papers I was submitting. I still remember a paper that came, and I sort of we were close to acceptance, and this person would keep trying to slip in a kind of a causal claim, And I said, look, you don't have to make a causal claim. This is Research Policy. It's fine. You can document something interesting. We can go there. But you almost seem embarrassed about having a paper that's descriptive, and you shouldn't be. So that was the first part. This is just an example of what I mean by taboos. On the flip side, many people would and this is, I think, a source of friction with some of my colleagues. Many people, less true now. In the old days, it was common to see articles in management where people would make causal claims based on correlational evidence. And that's not allowed. You don't get to do that. You don't have to make causal claims, but you can't make bad ones, for example.
So you also been now department editor at Management Science, and what are your formative experiences both as scholar but also as an editor, and how are there kind of discrepancies between the two, or do you also try to translate one to the other?
Yeah, so one of the big differences between being at research policy and at management science is in research policy, I was boss. I was editor, I made the decision, and that was the end of it. Here, I am, as they say, primus inter pares, right? There's an AE, there are the reviewers, and it's difficult for a department editor. It's possible, but one doesn't do it willy-nilly to overrule an AE, which means in some ways, paradoxically, my room for maneuver is more limited, right? Because you have an AE, the AE has said something. Once the AE writes down her report, it's sort of like a bureaucracy. It's part of the record, and I can overrule them, but I would rarely do that because the AE would be pissed off with me and then would not take the next assignment, and before you know I'm up the creek. But I think it's been important. At management science, we typically get well done papers, well executed, well crafted. They tend to be somewhat small because this tends to be a trade-off at times. So a recent paper where the authors had done something very beautifully to identify it, very nice, and nobody was really excited about the work. But the data were really interesting. So we had to do this kind of reject the paper. Then I called the authors who were really pissed with me. And I said, look, can we talk about this? So we have a Skype call. And I say, here's the interesting part about your paper. That's not what you've done because what you're stressing is causal identification. Why don't you guys write a paper on this? And I promise you it won't be rejected on grounds of taste or contribution. We could still reject it, we can't promise, but, and so they sent it back. They still had the causal identification. I said, what is it that we're not getting through? But it's part of the zeitgeist, right? That you have to have this. Anyway, long story short, we finally got it in, and I had to do it overruling 2 or 3 of the reviewers who said, reject, this is descriptive. And I said, yes, it is, but this is an important issue. So I don't know if that's what you had in mind, but yeah, it's kind of fun being on the other. One thing I learned from Will Mitchell, which I still remember, he said, this is not a democracy. When Will was editor, Will Mitchell, he said, it's not a democracy. The reviewers' comments are advisory. And I think that's absolutely right, because it's the editor's name that goes under the paper, accepted by X, not reviewed by Y and Z. So it's not a democracy.
So if you think of your papers yourself over the past 30 years, have there been some underdogs who never really developed, or some surprises that you actually didn't think of?
Yeah, so my most highly cited paper was one I wrote as a PhD student. This was the one on biotech alliances. This just to tell you how things are, right? Paul Milgram and Roberts developed their theory of complementarity in 88, 89. We're listening to them in the seminar at Stanford. Alfonso, who comes up with all the ideas, says, we can test this. I said, really? Yes, we can test this. And so he's looking at biotech alliances. And so we sneak into the GSP library, which has BioScan, which is the publication that used to list these alliances. And I used to spend my afternoons copying them by hand because we're not sure we're allowed to photocopy the thing, and it's so expensive in any case. Anyway, we had a grand total of 60-something firms. That was the size of the sample. Today, no editor would let you even get close to, they would laugh you out if you sent something in. We wrote the paper. It was terribly written. We were second, third year graduate students. We didn't know anything. Actually, Alfonso wrote most of it, which is why it was terribly written. Yes. Yes, he knows it. The reviewers came back and said, look, I still remember, one of the reviewers said, I quote, I happen to know the authors are young in the field, and this argues for an early publication. So that's how we got it. I mean, I would have rejected that paper. It was so bad. The one thing was we discovered a proof that what we were doing, which is the restriction on the variance-covariance matrix, that when I then showed to Paul Milgram, who didn't want to hear this because he was working on a different proof using affiliation with Weber. I think our proof was much better, much direct, but that's Paul Milgram for you. But other than that, I mean, I don't think any other paper I've written since then has had the same reception or the same impact. One way to think about it is it's been downhill all the way, last 30 years, right? Nothing I've done has quite compared, which is a terrible thing to think about if you think about it, but.
All right, then to close this round of questions from our side for now, if you think about your younger self, what advice would you give yourself based on the knowledge that you gained over these past couple of years?
Be less of a jerk to others. Young people tend to be arrogant. Be a little bit more understanding, but this is generally old people telling young people. This is not, I don't think there's anything particular. But yeah, I think as I've grown older, I can see more wisdom in other places where I was not willing to find it. And I would hope younger people would not be as narrow-minded as I was.
Does that also then translate in some work that, so when in our Skype call, for example, you also mentioned that most of the papers that get rejected under you being an editor is not because you reject them, but because the reviewers reject them. So what would you advise to the people that are reading a work? So not now less to PhDs, but more to anybody who is asked to do an R&R.
Yeah, no, I think, so this is a really great question. There are two ways to think about reviews. One way is, let me find all the reasons to reject this paper. And some papers actually deserve that, right? There's like, this is bad, this is terrible. In other cases, I wish people would say, here's what's interesting in this paper. This is more of a developmental review, and not all reviewers are well suited for that, but it would be really interesting to say, here's what's interesting in these data. Typically, if you think about an empirical paper, you say, what you've done with these data, this causal stuff, not that interesting, but you got this really cool data. Why don't you look at this question? And if it's not too far away, that might be the basis for an R&R saying, okay, yeah, I don't particularly like the question that you have, or that question that you think you're going to answer, you cannot answer because you really don't have the exogenous variation you want. or it's not that interesting. But here's a question that you can answer. I think it would be nice, at least as a to get that. I have to say, when I've submitted stuff, mostly after the initial, the reviewers are stupid, they didn't understand what I was trying to say. If I read the reviews carefully, it's like, yep, they're right. Yep, they're right. They're not fair, but they're right. And there's a difference. There are criticisms one of the first paper, I still remember the first paper I submitted, eventually got published at SMJ. Connie was the editor. The reviews come back, and we have firm fixed effects. This is way back when. And the reviewers basically are saying you have time-varying heterogeneity, firm-specific heterogeneity. This firms are changing over time. It's like, yes, the reviewer is right, but it's not fair, because I didn't know of a single paper published in SMJ that addressed that problem. But they were right. I think, again, in my life, I don't think I can think of very many unfair or wrong reviews. And part of it is just, I can see the point that the guy is making. But I think for reviewers, it's always good, and I do that. I never send my reports right away. When I write a referee report, I write it. And sometimes I get very angry, but it's like somebody's doing something. Write it, and you say, do I really need to say this? Do I really need to be a jerk like this? And so I'll not, particularly if it's a tough report, I will not send it out as a reviewer, but also as an editor. Wait, come back to it a day later and say, I don't need to say this. I'm just being a jerk here, right? I mean, I just want to tell them, you're stupid, why did you do this? But that's just me getting angry. It doesn't help the author at all. Just say, hey, why don't you do it this way? Instead of saying, why did you do it like this? Don't you realize this is blah, 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 So part of it is just growing up and realizing, we don't have to do it this way.
Thank you, Ashish. I would like to ask now the audience whether you may also have questions. And Tobias, I guess it's so kind to go around with the microphone. So does somebody has a question?
There are no drinks waiting for us after this, is there?
Was that? Yes. Okay.
So thanks so much. This is so interesting for us. You talked about this early paper you had with Alfonso and how it became impactful. I was wondering whether you think that in the beginning of your career you genuinely had more creativity, or you were more willing to take risks because you had few reputational costs and so on.
So that's actually an interesting point. I think I was never creative. Alfonso certainly was the creative one. I certainly was much more risk-taking, right? To write a history of the chemical industry as a second or third year assistant professor is not exactly good career advice. What has changed now is that the people I'm writing with are often PhD students or younger colleagues, and I'm much more concerned about their downside risks than mine. And that's actually made me less risk-taking as I've grown older. Is my co-authors have had more to lose, and it would be wrong for me to impose my risk-taking attitudes on them.
So in a world where you cannot have Can Arrow as a discussant for your master project, what's the advice you would give to PhD students on how to build a successful career in academia?
If you've been listening, I'm the wrong person to tell you how to build a successful career. I'm absolutely the wrong person. So look, I would give this advice to my colleagues, young colleagues, when I hired them at various points, which is, these are the best years of your lives. I still remember the fun I had as a graduate student and as an assistant professor, playing with ideas, nothing to lose, lots of things to play with. I paid no attention to what my senior colleagues thought of it. I never asked them. Again, not good career advice, but I'm just telling you what happened. I think in general that's a good thing. It's not, perhaps not great for your career right away, but there is, in our business, if you think about the decision theoretic, the behavioral decision theory, the feedback loops are so slow. You send something, by the time it gets in, it's 2-3 years. They're so noisy. We've all heard of, I told you my success story. We wrote a crappy paper that got published quickly, and we got a chance to fix it and make it better. But it could easily happen. There are really good papers that don't get it, that run into some tough reviewer or somebody who's not willing to think about, particularly now, things are tough. What that means is if you try and run your career based on what you think X or Y or Z would like, I think it's a recipe for unhappiness, because it's not clear that it'll succeed anymore, and you will spend a lot of your time trying to figure out what does Professor X really want. And it's very hard to figure out what they want or whether that's the right thing to do. You might as well not waste the best years of your life catering to the prejudices of old guys. You might as well do what you want to do. Doesn't mean it'll work well, but it's not clear that the alternative is any better. So you might as well do something that turns you on. That's kind of my take on it.
Thank you. I have a question that a few of us as young scholars have been discussing. So if a same paper is sent to research policy and management science, and if you send it to the same reviewer, do you expect that the same kind of review is coming back, and then do you have a different judgment to it?
No, I would judge them very differently. Each journal has a particular place and has particular mission. So I understood research policy's mission to publish interesting and important phenomena, not necessarily theoretically well-grounded or to make theoretical contributions. Management science has a different position, and so the criteria are different. So yeah, as an editor, I would treat things very differently based on where I was. Yeah, well, it's hard to know what reviewers will do, but yes, they should as well.
I have a question, Ashish. So, when we look at the canvas of your work, there are a couple of themes that sort of come together, and again, going back to the point of asking PhD students for advice, give us a number. How many papers would you write with one data set? At what point does it become stale? Or is there kind of, because there's clearly economies of learning on the one hand, but on the other hand, stuff doesn't get necessarily more interesting if 3 other papers have been published on that. Do you have a stance on that?
No, so I'm trying to think of the empirical number. So probably 2 is my guess. So with the biotech data, we wrote 2 papers. The first succeeded, that was the JIE. The second took more effort, took a lot more time, probably has been less influential. I would say, I'm trying to think, the data on science to software vulnerability. Yeah, but I think the sort of the empirical, my empirical thing is 2. The third one you're asking for trouble. is I think, yeah. I don't know. What about you guys? What's yours, Toby?
I think it literally, I have written just a single paper, but I've also had a couple of papers. I mean, 4.
On the same?
Well, not necessarily the same data set. I would augment it with other stuff, but it's kind of the same baseline data set.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see if you make significant upgrades, you might be able to get another one.
Right. But you're saying the 4th one is definitely out of.
You're really pushing it with 4, aren't you?
Now I have to take your microphone. This is an unfair question because you couldn't prepare for that. But since we have the slide open, it's also that, for example, all the work on IT and the IT sector, and for example, also vulnerability. So do you think that nowadays, with the changing economy and the way people work and how data is transferred, do you think that some of these things that you already looked at should be revisited, or would you like to go back to see whether it still holds under certain conditions, or do you, is there no need for that?
You mean, did I write wrong things?
No.
Probably, but I hope you would leave it alone. I don't know. It's probably true. I'm constantly, not constantly, but every now and then I worry that stuff I wrote was either wrong or at a minimum outdated. We certainly have this ongoing debate with Alfonso on markets for technology. How big a deal is it? Has it sort of run out of, should we rethink the whole issue on that? I suspect, well, in social sciences, I think that the speed at which we discover the truth is about the same speed at which stuff changes. So we're constantly in this where we're measuring the constants, and the half-life of the constants that we're measuring is about the rate at which we take to discover. So yeah, I think we probably do need to keep going back every ever so often to figure out what stuff is still correct.
So coming back to your advice from earlier on, that you said that as a PhD student, but also as a scholar, you should really pursue your interest and not research topics that are popular at the moment. But this implies also that you have to kind of do educational work in the field. What's your best advice on doing this? Is it going to conferences, I don't know, writing just a paper and leave the rest for luck?
I think okay, yeah. So look, it's a little bit different. I came through economics where you spent 3 years essentially getting trained in techniques, and then you're supposed to go off and do stuff yourself. I think in management we don't quite have or we shouldn't really have the same view, and so at least at both at Carnegie Mellon and at Fuqua, we have a much more apprenticeship-based model where the training and the research happen at the same point, which means as students, PhD students, certainly my PhD students, you don't quite have the same freedom that I had. But once you get to a certain stage in your career and you're becoming more of a mature scholar in your own right, then you should certainly be able to do that. Now, as to the education part, you have to figure out, you can't spend your first job trying to learn how to teach MBAs and also figure out how you're going to convince others that what you have. So it's much better if you can find a place which will pay attention. I was lucky. People like Sid Winter and Dick Nelson and these guys were there. They were interested in that. Dave Mowry and Nate. Because of my connection with Nate, I was introduced to these people as a student, and they were super kind to me. I told you I nearly got fired at Carnegie. It's because of these guys I didn't get fired, right? So find your Dick Nelsons and Sid Winters. And actually another guy, Eric von Hippel, super kind guy, wonderful, was always willing to take the time out to talk and was super helpful. Gave me great career advice, which I will repeat to you, because not enough people do that. So Eric told me, when you've written a paper, this is me as a second-year assistant professor, Eric von Hippel, chaired professor at MIT, already. He said, when you write a paper, those days we still sent people papers by papers, so we put them in an envelope. He said, put it in an envelope and send it to a bunch of people, senior scholars, who you think are interested in your work and whom you would want to have as your supporters. But here's Eric. He said, don't just send it in. Write a little note saying, dear Professor Kretschmer, this paper builds on this work of yours. Here's how I cite it, or here's how I build on it. All human beings, including the most famous professors, still want to hear that. Ah, yeah, so-and-so is working on it. Very good. Wonderful advice. Wonderful. A little anecdote, if I may. I wrote a paper, this is the paper in JEBO with Alfonso, the second paper from the biotech data set. I wrote Dick Nelson a letter saying, dear Dick, this paper builds on your paper in the I think it was the RE Stud Review of I forget. I said QJE. Let's say it was QJE 1968 or 1976. And promptly comes back a letter from Dick Nelson saying, thank you for your, dear Ashish, thank you for the letter. Did you mean the QJE or did you mean the Review of Economics and Statistics paper 1962? Because there I do this and here, like, oh shit. So be careful when you write. Make sure you're citing the right work, because some people will actually, will not just like, but this is great advice. If you do want people to take your work, say, here's how I build on yours, and cite it, and you're more likely to get them to pay attention to you.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, and with this insightful advice from your side, I'd say we close the session. Thank you very much for your participation, Ashish. And thank you everyone who attended the session.